All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode number 2 of the Tommy Joyner Radio Show. Again, this is the Productized Me edition where we talk about all things related to building, scaling, and selling businesses as it relates to service-based businesses with mostly recurring subscription-based business models, as well where we give tips to people in the freelance and agency world. With me today, I've got my buddy Bryan O'Neill from Quiet Light Brokerage. Super happy to have Bryan on. Bryan actually brokered the deal for the sale of my previous business, Content Pros, and it was a delightful process. And he was super knowledgeable, and I was really grateful for everything that happened through that. So I thought I would invite him on, and he graciously accepted to come on and talk to everybody today a little bit about the sales process and some of the stuff that entails. So Bryan, welcome.
Hi, Tommy. Thanks so much. And yeah, good to be here.
Awesome. If we could start out, if you wouldn't mind, man, just give us a little bit of a background of yourself. For the viewers, as I just mentioned, Bryan helped us negotiate the deal for Content Pros, which is the business that we just sold. But I wanted to kind of enlighten people a little bit more about your background, because before we got on the call, I actually read your background provided on the Quiet Light Brokerage website. And I know you have pretty extensive experience not only in buying and selling businesses, but in operating online businesses of your own. So give us a little taste.
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to bore you for too long with this and kind of give you a 30,000 foot overview. But yeah, so I've been a serial entrepreneur, for the lack of a better term, for as long as I remember. I think ever since I was something like 16. And I've always kind of been focused on technology and internet and everything online and so forth. Yeah, I've started, bought, sold a pretty sizable number of companies, but at the same time, for the last 11 years, I think, if my calculation is correct, my sort of one of my two main lines of business has been business brokerage and helping other entrepreneurs sell their online business. So I kind of I actually stumbled upon this industry pretty much accidentally. About I think about 12 years ago, myself and my then business partner we were building out essentially small websites, like AdSense websites, that had some content and a bunch of AdSense ads and making a couple of $1,000 a month. And we started selling those sites. So back then there was an online forum called the SitePoint Forum, which was essentially the marketplace for websites that was on SitePoint Forum grew into what is today Flipper.com. So that was kind of the pre-Flipper.com, so to speak. And we started selling the sites on that platform, and we were kind of successfully doing this for I think about a year or two. And at some point, other people started reaching out to us and saying, "Hey guys, you're doing such a good job building those sites up and selling them. Why don't you sell my site and keep 10% or 15% of the proceeds?" Yeah, sure, we'll give it a go. And that's essentially how we started the first brokerage. And yeah, man, ever since it's been a super interesting journey. I haven't been a broker that whole time. I've kind of jumped from here. From one place to another, and that at one point I started a online business due diligence agency. Then I consulted another big company who was trying to get into brokerage and so forth. But the long story short is that I've kind of always been involved in the industry in one way or another. And now for the last 3 years, I believe, slightly over 3 years, I've been teamed up with Quiet Light Brokerage and helping entrepreneurs such as yourself exit from their businesses.
Awesome. That's a really sweet background, man. I appreciate you throwing that in there for us. I have a question with regard to like why you were attracted to the idea of selling businesses in the first place. So obviously a lot of this stuff happens organically, you figure something out, you start doing more of it, and then people will ask you for your expertise or whatever. But in terms of why you started selling those sites, did you recognize that like, oh, like this website's only making like $1,000 or $2,000 a month, but if we sell it, we can make like $50,000 or $70,000 all at once, and that's a pretty quick way to like to stack some wealth. Like what was your thought process behind like what made that attractive?
Yeah, it was mainly that, and it was the fact that we were back then we were really good at churning those sites out, and in many instances actually turning them around. So we would go and buy a site, we'd build it up in like half a year or a year, and then sell it at 5x the price or 10x the price. So we were really good at doing this, but obviously in order to take all of this to the next level, we needed capital. So it was kind of the best way back then to churn out the capital and make sure that our own operation grows. But apart from this, kind of fast forward to the later years and to actual businesses rather than those small AdSense websites, these motivations kind of changed too. And even though I'm not in the business of buying and selling businesses per se any longer, I still do exit from a business from time to time, and the reasons behind this can be anything, but mostly it comes down to just wanting to move on to something different, or just realizing that you've done most of the things that you can do to build up that business, and your attention is best focused elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess that's something pretty common characteristic amongst entrepreneurs in terms of having another interest and wanting to move on to another project. So
Yeah.
in terms of like the reasons why you sell your business, they're infinite. So it's not just about acquiring wealth, although some people certainly do have that in mind when they embark on this. But you could just be simply bored and want to move on to a new project, and sometimes things have run their course.
Yeah, absolutely. But what's funny about this is that even though it's guys like us, it's kind of really normal to want to sell a business, to want to exit and move on to something else. The one thing that I've noticed over the years is that many people who are buying those businesses, they don't really think that way, and they need us to really explain to them why we're doing this, and kind of explain our thought process behind this. Because otherwise they may think that something is wrong and start inventing red flags that actually aren't there. Because in many cases, not the majority, but still in a pretty significant number of cases, I get phone calls from buyers, and their first question is, "Hey, so why would anybody sell their profitable business?" And many of those people are really at loss as to why anybody would do that, which is the point at which I tend to explain them the same thing. So I'm saying this so that everybody who's going to at one point sell their business and speak to buyers bear this in mind, and always realize that some of the things that are quite obvious to us might not be that obvious to the people we're going to be talking to about buying the business.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And just for all the listeners out there who are familiar with me or who are not, but maybe soon, the previous sale of our last business, Content Pros, when we were having our calls initially with prospective buyers with Bryan on the line, that was a question that we got every single time. And after having spoken with Bryan, he kind of laid out what he just said there, and we had to get used to answering that question. But because before I got on the call, I mean, it's an obvious question that someone would ask that, but I don't know if it's always something that you think about having to come up with an answer for, and kind of explain why you're trying to get out of a business to a prospective buyer. It's kind of it's weird because like you want to make sure you phrase that correctly as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. So, like in terms of some of the stuff that I think is going to be most helpful for this audience, a lot of these people have service-based businesses, and I know you're used to selling businesses, buying and selling businesses like from across the board. But I'm interested in speaking a little bit about like what the market is for businesses like content pros out there, and maybe even agency type businesses. Like, what's the like who is interested in buying those type of business, and what does the market look like?
So that's a good question. I would say overall the market is pretty good for these types of businesses, but it comes with a couple of caveats. So first of all, let's start with why the market is pretty good. It's pretty good because there's a fairly significant lack of supply. When you look around and you go through our listings or the listings of any major brokerage, you're likely going to see a whole ton of e-commerce businesses, and then maybe about 30% of the listings would be SaaS, depending on the brokerage, and then you would have maybe a couple of content sites and maybe one or two service businesses. So in terms of supply, there's a clear lack of supply, which means that there is quite a lot of interest. And the reason behind it is because not all buyers are interested in e-commerce. Not all buyers want to deal with physical products. I myself am a good example. So all these years I've stayed away, with one exception. I've stayed away from all e-commerce businesses because I don't like to deal with physical products, regardless of whether they're sitting in my warehouse or in Amazon's FBA. And there are a lot of people like this, and these people are out there, and they are looking for businesses that they like and that they can buy. Now, when I said that there are a few caveats, the main thing is that, and probably the main reason why there aren't more service-based businesses listed on the marketplace, is that a lot of those businesses tend to not be sellable. And I know that we're gonna get into this, and we're gonna be talking about what makes a sellable business. But just quickly, I wanted to say that many of those businesses are not built with the selling, with the transferability in mind, which in turn makes them unattractive to buyers. And in this sense, it doesn't matter whether it's a service-based business or an e-commerce business. It's just that this kind of stuff tends to happen more with service businesses. But again, we're gonna get into this, and we're gonna discuss all the things, all the metrics that make a good sellable business.
Yeah, we'll get into what it takes to build a sellable productized service, or service-based business rather, in a second. But that's a really good point that you made, and I think it's an interesting one as well in terms of the stuff that you didn't like about e-com. I think no matter what business you build or buy or sell, there's always parts of it that are challenging, and there's some that you're just not going to like. And there's no business that's without those challenges. They tend to just look different. So I think a lot of the things that people are opposed to, e-com gets, it's really hypey in a way. Like, people think like, oh, if I could just have an e-com business, like I could put it on autopilot, I don't really have to talk to anyone, this or that. But there is a way to build a productized service, or a service-based business in such a way where you don't have to deal with those headaches either. It just looks a bit different. So I just thought that was an interesting point that you made. Cool. So when it comes to like these type of businesses, a service-based business, like what is the average multiple that someone could expect to receive when they list this for sale?
So that's always a super tough question, because it's not tough per se. I could go into our sales history and pull up the average and tell you that it's 2.67x or 3.12x or whatever the number is. I'm just making those up at the moment. But in reality, that's probably not going to help anybody. And what I would instead like to focus on is the range. So on average, for a service business, we're seeing a pretty wide range of multiples, ranging from, I'd say, anywhere from about 1.5 years discretionary earnings to 3.5 years discretionary earnings. Now, obviously, that's a huge range, but it's quite important to realize that the range exists, and that it is so huge, because the stuff that we're going to be discussing now going further, all of this stuff is going to move your business within this range. So it's not the case that you have an average business and you're going to get an average multiple. It would be in an ideal world, but in reality, there's no such thing as an average business. And I think anybody who listens to this, they also don't want to build an average business. They want to build a business that sells for the highest possible multiple. So it's better to focus on this and focus on all the things that you can do to move up on the multiple ladder. And then ideally, you wouldn't even find the lower end of the range relevant, because you'd be juggling somewhere in the three times range with your business that has been built with selling it in mind.
So it's safe to say that the better business that you build, the higher multiple you can get.
Well, absolutely.
So yeah, I think that's just something that's important to keep in mind. I mean, there's probably a lot of different things that you could convince people to buy, which I think is another thing that I realized through this is like, this is like a very dynamic process, and it's really just a transaction between a buyer and a seller. So you can sell anyone anything that you've built, but the better the thing is that you built, obviously the higher price that you can command for that asset. All right, cool. One question before we get into some of the stuff that people can do to set up their service-based business for a sale down the road is, our business was a subscription-based service, so it had a recurring revenue model. One question that I had before we dive into this, because a lot of people watching this have agency businesses where they just have like project-based work. Is it necessary to have a subscription-based revenue model? And if they do have a model that includes like one-off sales, how does that get valued, and is that still a saleable asset? And what would make that a saleable asset if they do have a business like that?
So it's definitely not necessary to have subscription revenue. It's really good to have subscriptions in place, because obviously this signals the overall sustainability of the business and lessens the risk. But it's definitely not necessity. You can quite easily build and then sell a good business that only lives out of one-off projects and one-off revenue. The key there is going to be the sustainability of this revenue. So the bottom line is, let me put it this way: no buyer is going to care whether your revenue is billed automatically or manually, as long as they are certain that this revenue is going to continue to come in. So as long as you have your customer acquisition channels in place, whatever sales activities might be taking place, you have those either outsourced or automated. If all of this is in place, then really it doesn't matter all that much whether it's one-off projects or recurring ones. Obviously, again, subscriptions are really good, and a lot of buyers are looking for subscription revenue because it kind of adds this additional layer of protection. But it's definitely not a necessity.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and just something that I thought would be interesting to talk about. And then in terms of like the one-off sales, I imagine it would make a business equally as attractive if those one-off sales over the course of 3 years are coming from the same customers, because then you're still able to calculate things like LTV associated with that specific person buying that product multiple times.
Definitely.
Cool. All right, well, let's dive into a little bit about what people should do from square one. So let's imagine that we're starting a service-based business tomorrow. What are some of the things that people should keep in mind from ground up in terms of building a business that they can ultimately sell? So like, what would be some of the first steps that you'd recommend people take, or maybe some of the stuff that they should keep in mind now, having that end goal in sight?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to not so much do, but to understand is what are the things that are going to make a valuable business and a high multiple business 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, and this understanding really needs to be there from day one, because then, as long as you know all of this stuff, you can kind of make all your decisions with all this stuff in mind. And it's important to know from day one, because a lot of this stuff can have a long-term impact. Now, it's true that when a business is is sold and bought, buyers usually look mostly at the trailing 12 months or the last financial year, and then a little bit at the prior years in terms of growth. But most of the emphasis is always going to be on the trailing 12 months, and in case of external financing, the last financial year. So it's not that important how you run the business prior to this time, but it's still important in the sense that that buyers do look at these periods from time to time, and you still want ideally everything to be nice and above board over there as well. So it does really pay to know all of this stuff from the get-go, and there isn't really too much to know, really. I mean, there's a couple of areas, actually 4 areas that I can identify that will end up essentially making your valuation, making that multiple. So those areas are growth, risk, transferability, and documentation. Simple as. If you'd like, I can kind of go through all of those and kind of explain what's behind those and how. Yeah. So actually, just before that, let's talk about the multiples a little bit, because I know that you asked me what's the average multiple, and we're talking about the 3x multiples and so forth. I think many of the listeners would benefit from us having a quick chat about what that multiple actually stands for and what do we apply the multiple to.
Yeah, that's a good point. That was actually something that I learned a lot of through our previous process as well.
Yeah, there you go. So when it comes to the sale multiple, what we apply the multiple to is your trailing 12 months discretionary earnings. Now, discretionary earnings is actually not your net profit. A lot of people go around talking about profit multiples, which actually isn't true, because in most cases, with most businesses, your net profit is actually not what the business makes. And the reason why it's not is because as entrepreneurs, we tend to quite often incur expenses that the buyer of the business would not incur. So that could be, tax write-offs, like, maybe we're putting our car under our business while a car isn't really necessary to run the business, or any number of things. That's from one side. From another side, we also have often expenses that are just one-off expenses. So let's say we developed a piece of software that we're going to be using for the next 10 years, and paid $500,000 for it. That $500,000 is a one-off expense that shouldn't be taken into account when valuing the business, because that expense is not going to repeat itself. Right. So what's going to end up happening is we're going to take your net profit, your bottom line, and then we're going to add back all of those expenses. So all of discretionary expenses, we call them. And after this, we arrive at the actual bottom line, which is called the seller's discretionary earnings, which is essentially the amount of money that the buyer of the business is likely going to make from this business, or the buyer of the business would have made from this business if it wasn't for the discretionary expenses. And that's what we applied the 2x, 3x, 3.5x multiple to.
Yeah, I think just to jump in real quick. I mean, I think that's one thing as well that could actually make your business end up being worth a lot more than you thought. So for example, when we sold Content Pros, one of the things that we were able to take out was like our travel and event expenses and some of the stuff that we were able to write off through the business, but didn't ultimately impact the revenue of the business in such a way that we could actually include that back into the net revenue that was then taken into account to value the business with what ultimately ended up being included in the listing price.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about the 4 categories that make a good business and that attract a high multiple. So, like I said, we have growth, we have risk, we have transferability, and we have documentation. Growth is a really simple one. You business to be growing year over year, and if it's not a seasonal business, growing month over month as well. That's the main thing that buyers look at, and this is the one metric that has a super big impact on your multiple. If you let your business into decline, your multiple is going to go down the cliff, and the business is going to be perceived as a distressed asset.
Yeah.
As long as you're growing, everything is good. So really, it pays to always remain on the growth trajectory, even if you've decided that it's going to be your last 6 months and you're going to be selling the business in 6 months. It can be pretty tempting to kind of let the ball drop at this point. And I know from experience that from my personal experience, I've done that several times. But it really pays to still focus on growth and still run the business as if you would be keeping the business for the next 5 years up until the day that it's sold, because this is the kind of thing that has a huge impact.
I think we experienced that a little bit to a degree as well, and you can attest to the fact that like we had some stuff at the end that affected the ultimate sales price that we ended up receiving. But I think that's why it's even more important for people that have service-based businesses to really focus on getting some sort of predictable revenue model in place that allows you to know that, for example, you're going to acquire 5 or 6 customers every single month through this channel that you have somewhat systematized, because then when it comes time to sell the business, you don't have to have as many manual inputs associated with those sales that the business is going to keep making. And ultimately, obviously, that's something that becomes more attractive to a buyer because that's less maintenance for them and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's growth. Now let's talk about risk. Risk can mean anything, but when I say risk, what I mean is risk that the business's revenue, the business's earnings, are going to change dramatically to the negative anytime soon because of something that is in place that is inherently risky. So there can be a very big number of things that can cause this, but in most cases, and especially with service businesses, it's either single client risk or a single supplier risk. So when I say single client risk, it actually doesn't have to be a single client. It can be a handful of clients that generate the majority of the revenue of the business. So let's say that you've got a total of 100 clients, but only 3 of them generate 70% of your revenue. That's clearly a huge risk, because if something was to happen to any one of those 3 clients, the business would suffer significantly, and that obviously makes the business less attractive. And at the same time, the same thing happens on the supplier side as well. Because you never want to be overly dependent on a single supplier or a couple of suppliers, unless they are the kind of suppliers that are really easy to replace. So obviously, if you let's say that you're dealing with content writers and you pay them the absolute market average, and they're writing generic content, then it isn't really an issue, because you can go to Upwork and write and find the exact same kind of a content writer in 2 hours.
Right.
But if it's something more specific, or if you've negotiated a really good deal, then it becomes more of an issue, because a buyer is going to always think in terms of what if this happens? What if that happens? Is the business going to survive? Is the business going to make the same amount of money, or is its revenue going to tank? So you always want to make sure that you have those things in place and you can answer those what if questions.
Right.
So yeah, that kind of summarizes the risk element.
I imagine the same goes for. I mean, you talked about like contractors as well, but I mean, imagine the same goes for like key employees. You probably don't want to be too dependent on like one employee pulling so many levers, because if that person goes down, then the business is actually at risk as well. So that's probably something that buyers take into account when they're looking at a company.
Yeah, key man risk is definitely a thing. However, and that actually ties in nicely with the next category, which is transferability. If you were to ask me what's better, is it having a key employee that takes care of virtually everything, who comes with the business, or the owner of the business doing all this same stuff, then it's always, regardless of whether the key man risk is there or not, it's always better to have that person do all this stuff rather than having a fully owner operated business. And that's the main thing to talk about when we do talk about transferability, because transferability essentially means that the buyer wants to know that they can seamlessly take over the business and the business is not going to suffer.
Yeah.
Now, owner operated businesses are the worst ones in this regard, because that means that whoever is going to buy the business will either have to depend on the previous owner, still doing something, still consulting them for a long time or whatever, which no buyer is going to want to do for obvious reasons, or they have to start running the business and believe that they're going to be capable of doing it, that they're going to be able to learn everything in the span of what's usually anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. And that's also a scary prospect. And this actually brings me back to what I said when we first started talking about many service-based businesses not being attractive to buyers. And this is one of the main reasons, because a lot of those businesses are heavily owner reliant, which means that it takes a very specific kind of buyer to be interested in that business, because that buyer needs to be able to actually run the business themselves. Whereas if you're looking at a business that has everything outsourced apart from your main managerial stuff, that business is much more attractive, because virtually anybody can buy and operate the business. So yeah, while key man risk is definitely a thing, it's one up from having a fully owner operated business.
That's awesome, and this is going to go transition smoothly into your next point about documentation as well. But I think one of the main points and one of the things for service-based business owners to keep in mind is building a business that can operate without you. And while the systems that you build are really important as well, because they ultimately support some of those things and automate some of those tasks that you're not going to have to do yourself, or that a buyer wouldn't have to do when they take over the business. You can also sort of automate through employees. So as long as those tasks are being taken care of someone who isn't you, then that's something that definitely notches you up in terms of whether or not your asset is considered saleable, because you're not actually having to do them. So you can almost systematize through people in a way. And as Bryan said, that's definitely better than the alternative. Now, if you're creating a business that's fully automated, doesn't have to run with people at all, I imagine there's more advantages to that. But at the very least, as long as you're systemizing through people, that's still going to be an advantage when a buyer is looking at your business and considering acquiring that asset.
Absolutely, 100%. And you know what? Let's talk about SOPs for a moment, because that really ties in what Tommy just said. So when we talk about this systemization or automation through people, the underlying sort of facade of all this is having SOPs, standard operating procedures in place. So what you want to do, ideally, maybe not from day one, because the first say half a year to a year of every business is kind of hectic, and you're usually you would be at this time figuring out yourself what to do and what your processes are. But from there on, a really good exercise to do, say, once every couple of weeks or once a month, is to take a look at all of the processes, all of the main stuff, basically everything about your business that is repetitive. Absolutely everything that happens either on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, monthly basis, or even a yearly basis, and kind of start putting down procedures. They don't have to be detailed. It doesn't have to be a really detailed Word document with videos and stuff like this. It can be as simple as every Friday we're going to do this, and to do this we're going to go to that website, or whatever, sort of like a very basic thing. And this is going to this document or this collection of documents is going to become super handy when the time comes to actually put the systemization in place. Or automation. It's ultimately it's the same thing. That the end result is the same. And having this kind of stuff in place is going to be really, really good when the time comes to sell, because you can really use this to your advantage, and you can use this as a pretty major selling point, because essentially, regardless of whether you have a key man risk in place, what you can tell your buyers is, look, I've got everything documented, I've got everything systemized. So if anything was to happen to this one person, or this other person, or our support team that we're outsourcing some stuff to, then you can go and replace them, and you can have them follow the exact same procedure. And this puts the buyer's mind at ease, because it essentially again adds yet another layer of protection in case something was to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And the one thing that you said that really stood out to me as well, that I think a lot of people don't understand is like, I mean, I know I had this problem as well starting out, is when you think about SOPs, everybody preaches these things as something that's so important to your business. But when you're starting out, I would say completely forget about them. Like, you're ultimately going to build your systems and your procedures, but for the first 6 to 12 months, you're going to be killing yourself and creating SOPs before you're ready to create SOPs, because you don't even have anything to chisel away at and turn into a system. These systems are going to make themselves organically. And then once they have, it's up to you to document and then refine them. But you can't document and refine before that system actually exists. So I think with a lot of service-based business owners, they get in the habit of trying to, they start trying to create systems and procedures before they've actually know what that system or procedure is going to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and I couldn't agree more. It's I think what you're describing would almost be like writing a user manual for a product that you haven't built yet. Yeah. And that kind of isn't a smart idea. So yeah, absolutely, writing SOP should be, the focus should always be on documenting things, not creating things. And that's I agree. It's a super important thing to keep in mind.
And kind of a subtle distinction, because when you're starting out as a rookie entrepreneur, you're just not necessarily going to know that. You can read books like Built to Sell and whatnot, and they'll preach some of these things, and you won't necessarily know how to apply them until you've actually done that. So that can save you a lot of time as well. So key big takeaway. All right, cool. Can we summarize those 4 points again in terms of things that you should keep in mind when you're trying to build a business that's ultimately sellable?
Yeah, sure. So we were talking about growth, having year-on-year and month-on-month growth. Then we were talking about risk, kind of avoiding situations that would put your revenue at risk, be it on the client side or on the supplier side. And we were talking about transferability, which is essentially making sure that whoever buys the business is going to be able to seamlessly take over the business and run the business successfully from day one. And the last category that we're yet to talk about is documentation, which we should also cover, which is a fairly important pillar over there as well. So when I say documentation, I really mean two things. One being that it's kind of one thing to have great metrics and have a great business, but it's another thing to be able to prove it. And in the world of business acquisitions, especially online business acquisitions, where unfortunately there's a lot of dodgy stuff going on in the industry, and there's a bunch of scammers operating, etc., which means that buyers are fairly careful with what they're buying, and rightly so. So this means that you always need to be able to prove and document anything that you claim. So any revenue, any even expenses, anything that you claim that adds value to the business, you have to be ready to prove that what you're saying is actually true. Now, usually that's not overly difficult as long as you're not being stupid about it. You just need to make sure that you leave a paper trail, that I'm sure that's not going to apply to most people listening to this, but you don't accept cash payments which actually was a real life scenario that I was dealing with a couple of years ago, where I think about a third of a business's revenue was cash payments. They actually accepted physical cash, and obviously it's very, very difficult to prove this. So you want to make sure that your numbers are there and that they match up as closely as possible. And when I say match up, I mean stuff like bank statements, PayPal accounts, down to tax returns. Everything should match as closely as possible. Now, that's where many people like us who are serial entrepreneurs actually have issues. And those issues arise not because we're trying to hide anything, but because we're trying to, number one, optimize our taxes, and number two, kind of we try to kind of build the easiest structures possible. Right. So you probably know from experience that if you're involved in 5 projects that you're currently building, you're probably not going to go out there and register 5 LLCs and open 5 bank accounts. Right. It's probably going to be something at least is going to be commingled under one umbrella, and that's fine to an extent. But it's easiest to be fine when the amounts get big and when the time gets close to selling the business. So this is really, and I think that's one of the things we were actually struggling a little bit with your business. We managed to get past all of this, but obviously there was a lot of explaining, there were a lot of questions, and all of this could have been avoided. Yep. So I really recommend to anybody who thinks that they're going to sell their business, let's say within the next year, even better in the next couple of years, to kind of try to distance that business from everything else that you're doing as much as possible. So that might mean registering a new entity and either transferring this business to under the new entity, or transferring your other stuff out from that existing entity to a new entity, so that this one entity and this one bank account would only have income and expenses that are actually related to this particular business. It just makes things so much easier and also so much more attractive in terms of external lending, which is actually another part of having that documentation in place. So I said that there's 2 parts of it. One is what we were talking about, your due diligence, essentially making sure that the buyer is comfortable with the business. The buyer believes you. The buyer believes that the business is doing what you're saying that the business is doing. The other part, oftentimes, is the lender who gives the buyer the money to buy the business. Now, a lot of this depends on the size of the transaction. I know that with your business, we didn't really deal with many buyers who would use external lending because your business was just in the right size to attract cash buyers. But when it comes to a little bit bigger businesses, we see a very big percentage of transactions nowadays utilizing what's called an SBA loan. Yeah. That's a government-backed loan that can be used to acquire a small business. So that's usually, I'd say, in the range of say probably $1 million to $3 million, or even say about maybe even bring it down to about $500,000-700,000 to about $3 million. We see about half of our overall deals close through an SBA loan. Right. And that's all nice, and it's those loans are fairly easy to get. The buyer getting one does add a little bit of time to the closing sort of window, but usually it's not bad. It's typically anywhere from 30 to 90 days. So it's all good. However, the bank is going to have their own documentation requirements, and this is usually much more strict than the documentation that the buyer needs. So usually the thing with buyers is that you can reason with buyers. If you don't have a particular document, then you can usually reason with them, and you can essentially solve the problem by finding out what the buyer really wants to know and proving it to them some other way. Now with lenders and their often fairly complex structures, that's usually not the case. It's going to be the case that you're going to be requested a bunch of documentation. Then that documentation is going to go to end up on the desk of an underwriter. And in many cases, that underwriter isn't even going to call you to ask why something was missing. They just make their conclusion and say that the loan either was approved or wasn't approved. So you really want to make sure that all of this is in order. And this is where we get back to commingled books, because this is one of the things that lenders really, really dislike. Because a lender or their underwriting department is not going to go through all of your transactions and try to prove which lines on your bank statement were related to the business and which ones weren't related to the business. They want everything to be fully clear. So that's one thing to be reminded. If your business is going to be hopefully going to be in that price range, then you want to make sure that you don't do any commingling of, or if you do commingling, that it's absolutely minimal. And the same really applies to. We were talking about write-offs and discretionary expenses before. The same really applies to that stuff as well. I'm not going to tell anybody to stop writing off stuff that they otherwise would. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. And at the end of the day, any buyer and any lender is going to be fine if you write off a couple of grand a year on travel. That's perfectly fine. But it's still important to understand that you can't go overboard with all of this either. So you can't have a business that has, say, $500,000 a year in earnings show a net profit of $50,000 on its tax return if you want the buyer to get a loan using that tax return. It just won't happen. If it's if you're writing off, say, 10% of your earnings on things that are going to end up being add-backs, that's usually fine.
Yeah.
But if it's half your earnings, it's probably not going to be fine. So it's important to kind of apply a whole ton of common sense to this and not go overboard with anything in this regard.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And I know from our experience, our finances and our documentation was way, way more in order than a lot of other business owners that I know. And we still had some issues in terms of trying to explain this. And if our buyer would have required a loan, there's a good chance that they may have not been approved for an SBA loan based on some of the stuff that Bryan's talking about in order to buy our business. So definitely something to keep in mind. All right, cool. I'm glad you went into that, because when you first said documentation, I thought you were talking about SOPs, but that's a really good point and something to keep in mind. So at some point, get your accounting, get your bookkeeping in order, and try and keep everything separate as much as possible. So I don't know, some tips in order to do that might just be, setting up an independent entity, obviously, getting specific business credit cards, and just making sure that anything is personal stays personal, anything that's business stays business. You don't want to have to over-explain a lot of that stuff when it comes time to doing the due diligence associated with selling your business.
Yeah, those are really good tips. I would add one more, actually. Getting an accountant. And while we're at it, getting an accountant that is not your mother-in-law.
Yeah.
You won't believe how many people there are who have accountants who are in some way, shape, or form related to them, or they're good friends or whatever. This is always a bad idea. Without exception, is always a bad idea. Get an accountant who has experience with other businesses of this type, and have that accountant be responsible of your books, and you're going to be in a much better place when the time comes to sell.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. Well, as far as what we covered right here, that stuff is gold, you guys. For anybody listening, write that stuff down, write those 4 things down, pay attention to them, and really keep them in mind when you're trying to build a business that's ultimately going to be worth selling. There's so many things that you can pull from that you can already kind of use as a guideline to assume some of the stuff that you have to do as you build your business moving forward. And I think those are broad enough that you don't have to think too specifically about them. They're just good things to keep in mind as you chart a course towards building something that someone might want to buy. All right, Bryan, I really appreciate your time so far, man. Let's just jump into some other things that people should keep in mind if they're looking to sell their business, anything that's not related to maybe the 4 points. And then if you had one piece of advice that you could give someone building a business worth selling at the beginning, and you just had to kind of sum that up into one sentence, what would that be?
So I think in terms of other things to keep in mind, think we pretty much covered all of the important stuff. I could talk about a number of different things, but I don't think it's useful at this stage, because it's not that there's little point to overload yourself with things that end up having fairly small impact on the sellability of the business at the end. Yeah, it makes more sense to focus on the big things. When it comes to the one big piece of advice, I would say initiate the exit process far earlier than you would think to do it. So what I mean by this is that often enough I get phone calls from people who say that they want to sell their business now, or next month, or in 2 months. Doesn't make a difference. The point in time when I want to speak to those people is about a year before they start selling their business. And that's because when you call me and you say that, hey, I've built a business like this and I want to sell it, then we have what we have. We can't do anything. We're stuck with the business in the exact shape and form that the business currently is. But if we start talking about selling the business in a year, then there's things we can still do. And if I then review your business, review your financials, and I can spot things that are really hurting your valuation, then I can point those out to you, and you can go and work on those specific things for the year. And then you're going to come back, and we're going to be able to list the business at a much higher valuation than we otherwise would have. So that's really important to start the process early, and to speak to a broker early. I know that unfortunately there are many brokers and brokerages who tend to sell really hard, and they tend to try and say anything they can say to convince you to sell straight away. That's really unfortunate, and that's really bad practice, because in fact in most cases, and the majority of people I speak to, my advice ends up being not to sell the business at the moment, but to do X, Y, and Z, and then come back and speak to me again. There are other good brokers as well who actually look at things like this and actually work in their client's best interest. But it's quite important in this sense to at least initiate the conversations, and if that's what it takes, speak to several brokers. It's actually pretty easy once you've spoken to a few. It's pretty easy to tell who's out there to help you versus who's out there to make a quick buck. Because if you've got some brokers saying that they've got this and this tip for you, and you should hold off with the sell for half a year or for a year, and then you've got others trying to convince you to list the business for sale tomorrow, then you can be pretty certain who's out for your best interests and who's out for their own. So I think that would be the key tip that I wish more of the people who I work with would know and do.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a really good tip. And then just to give Bryan and Quiet Light Brokerage some props. We did speak to multiple brokers before we listed our business for sale, and we ultimately had the best feel with these guys and with Bryan in particular, and that's why we chose to list and ultimately sell with them. So it does make a difference, and people can tell, when you're having those conversations. So just use your head, and I think ultimately also trust your intuition when it comes to selecting a broker that you're going to work with. All right, Rick, one more quick thing before I let you go. Do you have any books or resources that you would recommend to people that you think are kind of like real gold in terms of places that people can go to kind of get a little bit more knowledge around this topic?
So unfortunately there aren't many. I wish there was, but when it comes to building and selling online businesses, there aren't too many. I would like to give a shout out to my colleague here at Quiet Light, actually, Walker D. Bell. So he published a book recently, which I admit I haven't fully read. He sent me an autograph copy, and I kind of skimmed through and read through I think the first third. But based on that and based on what I've heard from other people, I can really recommend that. So if you look up Walker Deibel, it's Deibel, and I think his book was called Buy Then Build, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, look that up.
Cool. I'll put that in the show notes as well, so you guys can take a look at that. Nice. That's a good recommendation. And as well, like, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of this information is like dynamic, always changing, and there's not a lot of books written specifically in the way, even the way that we just talked. Like that, this conversation right here is incredibly valuable. And coming from someone who just sold their business and wishing that I knew some of the stuff that I know now prior to going into that process, like everything that Bryan said here is super gold, man. So you guys definitely take notes on this and pay attention. All right, Bryan. Well, thank you so much for coming on, man. Like, a lot of gratitude to you. I know this is going to be super beneficial to my audience. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch with regard to questions like this, or if they're potentially interested in listing their business for sale as well?
Yeah, I think email is actually easiest. So my email address is Bryan with a Y, Bryan @quietlightbrokerage.com. I'm sure Tommy is going to put that somewhere in the notes as well. So yeah, if you want to reach out, feel free. Even if it's to ask a question or two. I'm not going to make you sign an engagement letter or start charging you. It's happy to help and give out advice.
Awesome. Yeah, I can test that as well. Bryan's a super helpful guy. So hit him up, Bryan @quietlightbrokerage.com with a Y. I'll put that in the show notes as well. And Bryan, thanks again, man. Really grateful to you. And yeah, we'll have to jam again sometime, man. This has been really fantastic.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Tommy.